The saloon at Redemption Creek dozed through a slow Tuesday night. Half the tables were empty. Three trail-worn cowhands leaned on the bar, nursing cheap liquor and cheaper regrets. In the corner, a lone gambler hunched over his cards, shuffling them with the stubborn dignity of a man whose luck had died a long time ago and left him behind. Behind the counter, the bartender wiped the same glass for the third time, his eyes dull with a lifetime of stories he no longer bothered to recall. It was the kind of place men drifted into when they wanted to disappear without dying, a place where questions were as unwelcome as sunlight. The door creaked open around sunset. An old drifter stepped in, bringing the desert with him. Dust clung to his coat and boots like memories that refused to let go. He was thin as a fence post, his skin baked to the color of old saddle leather. His hands trembled when he reached the bar. "Whiskey," he rasped. The words scraped out of a throat worn down by sand, smoke, and years. He looked less like a man and more like a ghost that hadn't figured out it was supposed to stop walking. In the corner, a young man watched him with lazy amusement. Jack Caldwell was 24 and wore his confidence like an expensive coat. He was quick on the draw, quicker with a smart remark. He'd killed 3 men in straight-up gunfights, men the town agreed had it coming. That was all it took for Jack to start believing he was something special. Men like the old drifter made him grin. Before we ride further into this story, tip your hat to the channel, hit subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which country you're listening from. Now, top off your glass and settle in. Because before this tale is done, you'll learn a hard lesson about judging a man by what you see instead of what he survived. Jack rose from his chair, warmed by cheap whiskey and that dangerous kind of certainty that only belongs to men who have never truly been tested. His spurs chimed with every step, each jingle an announcement. Jack Caldwell was coming. The bartender stopped polishing the glass. The cowhands went quiet. In Redemption Creek, everyone knew what happened when young men decided to measure themselves against old ones. The outcome was always the same. Somebody bled. "Well now," Jack drawled, sliding up beside the stranger. His voice oozed fake kindness, the kind that cuts deeper than a knife. "Look what the wind dragged in. Old-timer, you look like the desert already tried to kill you and just got bored." The drifter didn't turn his head. He stared into his whiskey as if the glass held answers to questions he'd grown too tired to ask. Gnarled knuckles, scarred and twisted, trembled around the rim, spelling out a story of age, weakness, and irrelevance. "I'm talkin' to you, Grandpa," Jack pushed, his bravado growing in the silence. "You deaf or too dumb to notice when a young buck's addressin' you?" "Nothing." The old man lifted the glass and took a slow drink. The silence settled heavy over the saloon, a thick blanket of tension. Jack's fingers drifted toward the butt of his gun like they had a mind of their own. This was his pattern. Somebody didn't show respect, and Jack reminded them why fear had a name and a face. "Listen here, you sun-dried relic," Jack said, his tone hardening. "I've put 3 men in the ground fair and square. Got a reputation that runs from here clear to Santa Fe. And out of the kindness of my heart, I'm givin' you the chance to apologize for standin' there lookin' like a curse on everyone's eyes. You gonna do that, or am I gonna have to teach you how the world works?" The drifter finally turned. His eyes were pale blue, so washed out they were almost colorless, like the sky a heartbeat before the storm breaks. When those eyes met Jack's, something flickered there, not fear, not rage, just a tired, bottomless sorrow. "Walk away, boy," the old man said quietly. His voice was soft, almost gentle. "I don't have anything left to prove." "Oh, but you do," Jack laughed, truly amused now. It was the carefree laughter of a man who didn't yet understand how fragile he was. "That's the difference between us, you ain't proved a damn thing." He shook his head, still chuckling. "Nothing to prove," Jack mocked. "Old man, you look like you couldn't prove you exist. Only reason you're still breathin' is stubbornness and bad luck." The drifter turned back to his drink. "I warned you," he murmured. "You push this any further, it's on you." Jack's hand settled fully on his gun. Every soul in that saloon felt the air change. This was the ritual the West never tired of repeating, the young gun trying to carve his legend out of an old man's shadow. Nobody doubted the outcome. Jack was fast, they'd all seen it. Fast in Albuquerque, fast in El Paso, fast in Tucson, fast enough to send 3 men to their graves before they even realized they were dying. But he wasn't faster than the old drifter. Jack drew his revolver cleared leather with smooth, practiced speed. He was quick, very quick. The problem was the old man moved like someone for whom time no longer worked the same way. The drifter's hand came up in a motion that didn't look fast so much as inevitable. He gripped an old Colt that looked like it, seen the Civil War and lived to talk about it. Two shots cracked almost as one. Jack's bullet shattered a bottle behind the bar, sending glass and whiskey raining down. The old man's round tore through Jack's shoulder, slammed into the wall and bit deep enough to leave a crater in the wood. Jack dropped his gun and crashed to the floor, clutching his shoulder as the blood spread hot and wide across his shirt. His eyes were huge, stunned, trying and failing to fit what had just happened into the world he thought he understood. He'd drawn first. He'd been faster. It wasn't supposed to be possible. Told you to walk away, the drifter said, turning back to his whiskey. He took another drink. This time his hand didn't shake at all. Whatever tremor he'd had before was gone. He reached into his pocket, dropped enough coins on the counter to pay for his drink and the broken bottle, then turned toward the door. Only when he moved did the bartender finally find his voice. Who are you?" the man stammered. The old stranger paused in the doorway. Behind him, Jack lay on the floor, groaning, clutching his wound, understanding that death had come close enough to touch him and then passed by. The drifter looked back over his shoulder. Those pale blue eyes seemed to hold the weight of whole decades. "Name, Samuel Cross," he said quietly. "Ain't heard anyone use it in near 30 years. Then he stepped out into the night, his shadow framed for a moment in the door like a character walking off the edge of a stage. Inside no one moved. No one spoke. Jack lay bleeding and learning the hardest lesson of his life, that being quick wasn't the same as being good, and pride always rode ahead of a hard fall. By morning, every soul in Redemption Creek had heard the name. Samuel Cross. With the name came old stories shaken loose like dust off a long-forgotten trail. Taley's people had filed away as legend, nothing more. They said Samuel Cross had worn a badge back in the 1860s when the West was still being written in dust and gunpowder. They said he'd put more men in the ground than anyone could keep count of, that he'd chased outlaws across 3 territories and never once lost a trail. Then sometime around 1875, he disappeared. Some swore he was dead. Some swore he'd gone mad and wandered off into the desert. Others whispered that he'd struck some dark bargain and walked clean out of the world. But he hadn't died. He'd simply stopped being Samuel Cross, the name whispered in saloons and sheriff's offices, and turned into something smaller on the outside and heavier on the inside. A nameless old man drifting from town to town like smoke, like memory, like regret given flesh and bone. He rode out of Redemption Creek before dawn, his horse plodding steady under him, his eyes fixed on the horizon where there was nothing waiting but more desert, more little towns, more ghosts with his face. Samuel had been moving for 3 decades, ever since the day he left the badge, the gunfights, and the crushing responsibility of being the hand that carried death in a country that always seemed to need more of it. But the West has a long memory, and it doesn't let go easily. The next settlement was called Dry Gulch, barely big enough to deserve the name of a town. A few buildings, a street of dust, a boarding house that smelled of boiled coffee and old quilts. Samuel arrived on a Thursday, paid for a room, and tried once again to vanish into the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. He wasn't hunting trouble. He'd spent years learning how to walk around it. Trouble, however, had spent those same years learning how to find him. On his second day there, a man named Dutch Atrix stepped into the boarding house. He was in his 50s, built broad and thick like a bear that had seen too many winters. A scar sliced from his left eye to his jaw, pulling his face into a permanent scowl. He spotted Samuel at a table, eating eggs in silence. The blood drained from his face. "Samuel Cross," he whispered, as if saying the name too loud might call down lightning. Samuel didn't look up. "Don't know that name," he said. "Liar." Atrix dragged a chair over and sat down without asking. The wood creaked under his weight. "I know that face, I know those eyes," he said, breathing hard. "You're the man who hunted my brother, the man who put a bullet in Jeremiah Hendris back in '71. Samuel set his fork down with care. He'd known this moment was coming. You don't carry that many ghosts and expect them all to stay quiet. Your brother was a murderer, Samuel said calmly, and a thief. My brother was a man, Atrix shot back, and there was an ache in his voice that had nothing to do with anger. And you killed him. Yes, Samuel answered. There was no sense in lies, he'd worn them out decades ago. I did. He killed 7 people, men, women, 1 child. He preyed on folks. Prey has a right to live. Predators have to be stopped. Atrix's hand went to his pistol. He never drew it. Samuel's pale eyes lifted and met his. For a heartbeat, Atrix wasn't looking at an old man. He was staring straight into the calm, waiting face of death itself. Don't, Samuel said. The single word stopped Atrix cold. In that moment, like a man waking from a fever dream, he saw how this would end if he pulled the gun. He saw his own body on the floor. He saw the inevitable line of the bullet between them. The resolve in his shoulders sagged. I've been hunting you for 30 years, Atrix said, his voice hollow now. Spent my life promising I'd avenge my brother. I know, Samuel replied quietly. Can see it in your eyes. That's 30 years you can't ever get back. 30 years feeding a ghost instead of living your own life. And if you let it, you'll burn 30 more the same way. He pushed his chair back and stood, bones cracking. Your brother was what he was. I did what had to be done. You, though, you still got time to be something else. Samuel left money on the table for his breakfast and walked out of the boarding house, then out of Dry Gulch, then back into the desert. Behind him, Dutch Atrix sat alone, staring at the empty chair across from him. The revenge he'd dreamed of for half a lifetime hadn't ended in a gunfight or a grave. It had ended in a mirror. The past was gone, the dead were staying dead, and revenge, he realized, was just a fancy word men used for wasting whatever time they had left. Samuel rode 3 days straight. The desert didn't care who he'd been or what he'd done. It didn't care about his tally of kills, his badges, his regrets. It offered nothing but hot days, cold nights, and a sky big enough to swallow every secret a man carried. He slept under stars that had watched empires rise and fall. In his dreams, he saw faces, men he'd killed, names he'd tried not to forget. The weight of each life lay against the scale of why it had been taken. Justice on one side, blood on the other. By the time he reached Silver Spur, he knew something had shifted inside him. 30 years of running hadn't erased Samuel Cross. It had only buried him under wrinkles and tremors. Underneath the worn skin and shaking fingers, the same man remained. The one who had killed more than some small armies, the one who'd once been the sharp edge of justice in a land that badly needed someone willing to draw that line. It was in Silver Spur that everything turned. A telegram arrived at the sheriff's office on a Tuesday. It was addressed to Samuel Cross. That meant somebody out there still knew him, still tracked his shadow across the map. Sheriff Tom Garrett, a broad-shouldered man with honest eyes, brought it himself to Samuel's room at the hotel. This came for you, Garrett said, handing over the yellow paper. Didn't know we had anyone important stayin' in town. Samuel unfolded the sheet. He read it once. Then again. His hands started to shake, not from age this time, but from something he'd nearly forgotten how to feel. Hope. The message was from a woman named Margaret Webb. Once upon a time, before the badge and the legend, she'd been Margaret Cross, his wife. Before the killings and the gallows, before he chose the gun over the front porch, duty over dinner at home, she had walked away in 1870, unable to live with a man whose hands never stayed clean for long. 48 years. 48 years of silence. Now she was dying in Denver, a month to live, maybe less, and she was asking to see him. One last time. Samuel settled his bill, saddled his horse, and turned north. Behind him, Redemption Creek, Dry Gulch, Silver Spur, towns, faces, stories blurred into the same dusty trail of memory. Ahead waited Denver, Margaret, and something he'd never truly expected to find. A chance, however small, to make peace with his own past, not with a gun but with presence, with honesty, with simple human company. Denver had grown into a sprawling city. The frontier edges had been sanded down, trains screamed through on regular schedules. Electric lamps burned along the streets at night, pushing back the dark. The Wild West was turning into something else, something tamer. Something that didn't need men like Samuel Cross anymore. The thought filled him with a strange mix of grief and relief. Margaret lived in a modest house on the outskirts, nothing fancy but solid, rooted. Samuel stood at her gate for nearly an hour, staring at the door, trying to decide if he had the right to knock on it. 30 years away from each other, 48 since she left, that was a lot of time for a man to wonder if he was still welcome anywhere. At last he made himself walk up and knock. The door opened to a woman in her 30s. Her name was Elizabeth. He knew that before she said it, he could see Margaret in the line of her jaw, in the curve of her smile, in the steady, appraising eyes. Margaret had remarried after leaving him. She built a life, a real one, the kind that had room for birthdays and family dinners, not bullet wounds and wanted posters. "You're him," Elizabeth said quietly, studying him, "the man from the telegram, Samuel Cross." "I am," he answered. "My mother said you'd come," she went on, "said you wouldn't be able to refuse her. Not really, you never were good at telling her no." She stepped aside. "She's in the back room, she's been waiting." Samuel stepped inside. The house smelled like lemon oil and old books and the faint ghost of flowers. It smelled like a life lived in seasons instead of gunfights, like continuity, like roots. He walked past photographs on the walls, Margaret smiling beside another man, a kind-eyed fellow who had never carried death around his waist. Pictures of Elizabeth as a child, a grandchild Samuel would never know. He reached a closed door and knocked softly. "Come in," a voice called. He knew that voice instantly, though time had thinned it to something fragile as dried paper. Margaret lay in bed, her body worn down by sickness, skin pale and drawn, but her eyes were the same deep brown he remembered, sharp, gentle, unafraid. A smile rose slowly to her face, and it was the smile of someone who had waited a very long time without ever truly giving up. "Samuel," she breathed, "you came." "You asked," he said, easing himself carefully onto the edge of the bed, afraid that even his weight on the mattress might break her. "I've been watching for you in the papers," Margaret said. "Every few years there'd be a story, some town in trouble with a gunslinger, and then a mysterious old stranger would ride through and settle it." Her eyes glowed with quiet certainty. "I knew it was you, couldn't say how, I just knew. I could feel you moving through the West like a ghost." "I tried to stop," Samuel told her, "tried to be someone else, someone who could have stayed with you." "I know," she said, "that's why I left." Her fingers slipped into his weathered hand, warm and gentle. "I loved you too much to watch you tear yourself apart pretending to be something you were. You were born to stand between people and the darkness that hunts them. I couldn't live in that world, but I could respect it from a distance." They talked for hours. Margaret told him about the man she married after him. A quiet, decent husband who'd shown her that love didn't always have to burn like a wildfire, that it could be steady, uncomplicated, safe. She talked about Elizabeth, about the grandchild he'd never meet, about years built on small joys instead of grand, dangerous passion. Samuel told her about the long roads, the men he'd faced, the slow realization that some trades sink too deeply into the bones, that he had become so good at violence, true redemption might always sit just out of reach for him. "I never forgave you for leavin'," Samuel said at last. "Not until recently. I wore that anger like a coat for so long I forgot why it was there." "I know," Margaret said, squeezing his hand. "But I forgive you for the years you spent hating me, and I want you to forgive yourself for being exactly what you needed to be when the world needed you that way." 5 days later she was gone. Samuel was holding her hand when her breathing slowed, then faded, then stopped. The last thing she said was his name. Just his name. Spoken like a blessing. Elizabeth let him stay for the funeral. Samuel stood at the back of the church, a man who'd killed more people than he could count, and realized he'd never truly learned how to mourn. He stood silent through the hymns, the prayers, the words spoken over the coffin. When it was over, he slipped out without saying goodbye. He rode away from Denver alone, heading south and west, back into country where the sky felt big enough to swallow him if it wanted to. Something, however, was different. The burden he'd carried for half a century, the weight of being Samuel Cross, gunslinger, killer, judge, and executioner, felt lighter. Not gone, the ledger would never be erased. but shifted like a heavy load moved to a better place on the shoulders. He wandered for weeks. He passed through nameless towns, never staying long. He helped an old widow mend a broken fence and didn't give her his name. He sat with a young man wrestling with demons and just listened, offering no advice, only presence. He paid for a stranger's meal in a cramped little saloon because the man looked like he'd run out of everything except hunger. Small acts, quiet offerings. He smiled at the irony when he reached a valley whose name the locals had given it half-jokingly, Redemption Valley. There he rode into town just as a storm was about to break, not of rain but of bullets. A fresh-faced sheriff, maybe 30 years old, stood alone in the street facing down a gang of hard-eyed outlaws. He had courage, that much was clear. What he didn't have was enough experience to survive what was about to happen. Samuel rode in slowly, letting everyone see him. The outlaws shifted, uncertain. Some recognized him from stories, others simply felt their gut twist at the sight of that pale, steady gaze. By the time he stepped off his horse, silence had washed over the street. The gang turned to run. Samuel's gun spoke twice. 2 men dropped and didn't get up again. The rest broke like loose sand in a dust storm, scattering in all directions. The young sheriff stared at him, eyes wide with a tangled mess of fear, gratitude, and awe. "Thank you." The sheriff breathed, "I don't know who you are, but thank you." Samuel looked at him and saw himself 50 years earlier, full of fire, sure that justice was clean and simple, that right stood on one side of the line and wrong on the other. He wanted to tell him that life would blur that line, that the older he got, the more the colors bled together, that the space between justice and murder was thinner than a razor's edge. But it wasn't his place to steal another man's future lessons. "You're welcome, son," Samuel said instead. He swung back into the saddle and rode out of Redemption Valley, leaving behind another story that would twist itself into legend by the time the week was done. Another tale of an old drifter who appeared when the chips were down and disappeared before anyone could thank him properly. The desert called and Samuel answered. He knew he didn't have many years left. His heart misfired more often than not. His hands shook once again, but he'd grown comfortable with the idea of dying. Death was just another trail to ride, and he'd been riding trails his whole life. In the last town he came to, a place so small the map couldn't be bothered to name it, Samuel finally stopped. There was an abandoned cabin on the edge of the desert, leaning but still standing. Samuel patched the leaking roof, replaced broken window panes, and settled in like a man preparing for a long winter. To the locals, he was nobody special. Just an old man with calm eyes who could fix a latch, mend a wheel, repair a roof if you needed help and didn't have much money. He sat on the porch every evening, watching the sunset spill fire across the sand. For the first time in his life, he managed to live quiet in the way he'd been trying and failing to do for 30 years. One evening, as the sky burned red and gold, a rider came up the path. Samuel recognized him before the horse had even fully stopped. Jack Caldwell, the brash young gun from Redemption Creek. Only he wasn't so young anymore. One of his arms hung stiff and half-useful, and a scar tugged one side of his face, but his eyes were clear, steady. He was alive, and more than that, he was settled inside his own skin. "I've been looking for you," Jack said, dismounting, "not to kill you, to thank you." Samuel gestured to the spare chair on the porch. "For what?" "For proving I wasn't half as good as I thought I was," Jack said, sitting down. "For showing me there's always a taller mountain. I spent the last 30 years trying to become a better man, a better gun, a better person. Because of that bullet you put through my shoulder, you damn near killed me, and that's what saved me." A rare smile tugged at Samuel's mouth, and this time it didn't feel forced. "I'm glad," he said. "I've sent a lot of men to their graves. It's a comfort to know at least one shot led to something better." Jack stayed for supper. They talked long into the night, about time, about redemption, about the strange arithmetic of a life soaked in violence. By the time Jack left, they weren't adversaries anymore. They were something Samuel had almost never had. Friends. Watching Jack ride away, Samuel understood something he'd never quite believed. Forgiveness sometimes comes from the unlikeliest places. Not all the men he'd shot had filled their afterlives with hate. Some, like Jack, had taken their pain and hammered it into something useful, something good. The next morning, Samuel woke and felt his heart stumble in his chest. It didn't right itself. He sat on the edge of the bed, waiting, knowing without fear that this was the moment he'd been walking toward for years, the end of the trail. Fear, he figured, was a luxury for men who thought they still had tomorrow. He walked slowly out to the porch and settled into his chair one last time. The sun was just beginning to rise, dragging light over the dark in slow, patient strokes. The sky turned gold, then orange, then red, harsh and beautiful in that way only desert mornings could manage, honest and utterly indifferent to whether men lived or died beneath it. Samuel Cross, gunslinger, killer, protector, husband, lover, lawman, judge, and weapon, sat there and let his heart beat slow. The desert whispered its ancient secrets around him. The sky seemed to open up like a door. And somewhere, faint but clear, he could almost hear Margaret's voice calling him home. 3 days later they found him. Samuel was still in his chair, hands folded, pale blue eyes fixed on something beyond the horizon, something only men who had already crossed over were allowed to see. He'd left money for his burial and written instructions that no name be carved into any stone. The town buried him in an unmarked grave at the edge of the desert. Only a scattered few knew who he really was. But the stories, those didn't stay buried. They drifted along cattle trails and through campfires, seeped into saloons and bunkhouses and little frontier churches. Folks told of an old drifter named Samuel Cross, more dangerous than he looked, more dangerous than anyone realized. A man who spent 30 years of his life trying to balance the scales after a lifetime of tipping them with other men's deaths. They told of an instrument of violence who learned too late to save everyone but not too late for himself, that redemption doesn't come from forgetting what you've done. It comes from understanding it, from accepting it, and from spending whatever days you have left trying in every small way you can to be better than you were. In towns across the West, older men would lean in over their drinks and share that story with hot-headed young guns. Boys who thought they were fast, feared, untouchable. They tell them about Samuel Cross and about the cocky kid who laughed at him, never knowing the old man had buried more killers than the desert itself. And maybe, just maybe, some of those boys would think twice before they cleared leather. Maybe they'd understand that speed wasn't everything, that reputations lied, that the quietest man in the room, the one who looked half dead already, might just be the most dangerous soul they'd ever meet. Samuel Cross died. His legend didn't. And in the end, that might have been the only kind of redemption a man like him was ever meant to have. If this ride through the Old West spoke to you, don't forget to subscribe, leave your like, and tell us where you're listening from. Out here, every story brings another sunset, another gunslinger standing at a crossroads. The frontier is full of men like Samuel Cross, men who carry their past like a cross on their backs, and spend the rest of their lives trying to walk it toward the light.